Hey folks, welcome to week 11. We have a lecture here to support our topics this week on food security, food sovereignty, and continue our discussion of social movements related to food and agriculture. We have two main topics for this lecture recording, food security and food sovereignty. And I'm going to start off with security, but we'll see how the two relate to each other as we go through this slide and into the next slide. Food security is a key challenge for a lot of families in the U.S. and around the world in lots of different contexts. In the U.S., we actually have tens of millions of families that are considered to be food insecure or have lack of secure access to food. There's a couple different ways to define food security or food insecurity. The United States Department of Agriculture really has done work in recent years to try to distinguish between what food insecurity is and hunger is. Hunger used to be the main way in which we tried to address whether or not there was some set of social problems, structural problems related to food. If people were hungry, then we considered them to be, in a way, kind of food insecure, even though that wasn't the term we used for it. As we shifted towards this understanding of food security, we started to get a better sense that even if people aren't necessarily hungry, they may still actually have challenges that they face for themselves, for their families, and their communities related to access to food. That's where the term food security came, or lack thereof food insecurity, because of that realization that hunger wasn't necessarily always the key determinant for whether or not somebody faced a challenge in terms of their food supply. And so now the USDA has this definition of low food security as a household level economic or social condition of limited or uncertain access to adequate food. So in that sense, it's really in part about hunger in some cases, but more often about scarcity and about uncertainty. This kind of not knowing where your food is going to be coming from next, having to juggle your food budget through the month, through different seasons of the year, depending on whether you had a stable income, depending on whether you have certain benefits, including things like school lunches. Schools are a major source of food for kids. And so summer months are a really challenging time for a lot of low-income families in the U.S. because their kids aren't in school. The kids aren't getting that free breakfast, that free lunch at school. Even during the pandemic, there was a real challenge as kids were sent home to do remote learning. How could schools continue to serve that social function, that important food-based function of supporting families through food aid? So food insecurity is the idea that you're not always sure where your food is coming from. Maybe you actually have enough to survive and you're not hungry, but you're constantly having to juggle. And so there's a connection there with other things in your life, lots of things related to structural aspects like jobs, like your family structure, stability in the family, and other connections to institutions and factors in your life that make it potentially connected to hunger, but maybe not so. That's probably more of a concern for what the USDA describes as very low food security families. And that's situations where families are indicating, and this is all done through surveys where they survey low-income families to find out to what extent they do or don't have consistent access to food. For very low food security families, or I guess you could say highly food insecure families, they have repeated reports of disrupted eating patterns and reduced food intake. So where they're rationing food, where maybe the parents don't feel like they're getting enough food because they want to give more food to the kids. And those are situations where maybe hunger in the U.S. at least is a little bit more likely. And obviously those are families that face the most challenges in terms of just feeding themselves, let alone the other things in life that they try to work their way through. So just a few examples from some USDA data. Here you can see this pie chart that shows the percentage of families that are under their designation food secure and those that are food insecure, whether it's low food security or very low food security. You can see that roughly about 10%, a little bit over 10% of families in the U.S. in 2019 were considered food insecure by this USDA set of guidelines. That's going to be totally different in 2020 and 2021 because the pandemic, and we might have a chance to discuss this a little bit more in class, has really strongly affected food security and increased food insecurity in the U.S. There's many families who were low income or maybe even low middle income who lost their jobs, who have reduced pay, maybe are losing support from unemployment as the government kind of drags its heels in getting more aid packages out. So these numbers are bound to go up. And we'll see in a moment on a chart that there's a lot of changes that happen from year to year based on how the economy is going that really affect food security overall. But you can see that there's this chart's kind of a little misleading. It kind of makes it look like everyone's food secure for the most part, except for this 1 in 10 slice, which is obviously a really sizable portion of our population. But even food secure households, as we see in the pandemic, now can pretty quickly be shifted into food insecurity. So even though that big red chunk of the pie looks like, okay, that's the stable part of our population, people in that group also can be pretty easily thrown into this situation of uncertainty with respect to their food. This table shows you kind of a bar chart that has some different demographic characteristics for households and individuals in terms of food security. And so you can see that the bars, the further they go to the right, the higher the percent of households that are likely to be food insecure. And so you look at where the longest bars are. Single moms with kids, you have going on 30% of those families in the country are food insecure. Other households with kids tend to be higher as well. Black and Hispanic families are more likely to be food secure by a factor of double in the case of African American families compared to white non-Hispanic families for those bars. And then, of course, this income to poverty ratio. If you have lower than 1.0, that means like at the poverty level. If you're right at the poverty level or below that, 1.0 of whatever level of. So say for a family of four, I think the poverty level is around $28,000. So 1.0 would be right at that level. But even for families that are a little bit over that, multiply that income by 1.3 or 1.85, just under double of the poverty level, still really likely to be food insecure. So there's a really strong relationship between people who are at the poverty level or maybe just a bit above the poverty level, that they're the ones who are more likely to be food insecure. And of course, again, that's really going to be shifting with the pandemic. Even some differences in terms of people who live outside of metropolitan areas, more in rural areas like we see in central New York, as well as people who are in cities and are maybe lack access to food sources because of food deserts or other structural factors like that. So depending on who you are, where you are, what your situation is, you can be more or less likely to be food insecure based on those demographics. And as I was saying before, there's a really strong correlation between how the economy is doing overall and levels of food insecurity. And so you can see over the years, we actually had a bit of a dip in 2019 that was similar to the late 90s and early 2000s. There's a rapid increase in food insecurity in 2008 because of the Great Recession that happened at that time. And as the economy really took a turn for the worse in 2008 and after, you can see that there's this spike and plateau of food insecurity that trickled off as the economy picked up again. Unemployment was at relatively low levels prior to the pandemic. If we get some data for 2020, and already some of this information is starting to come in, both anecdotally in terms of really skyrocketing demand for support at food pantries, increased use of SNAP benefits or food stamp benefits that help support families with government benefits from the USDA to support their food budget. All those indicators seem to show that there's going to be a pretty major spike in 2020 for food aid needed by families and levels of food insecurity. So overall, that kind of gives you an idea of some of the especially economic dimensions of food insecurity. One thing I think that isn't really represented that well in the USDA definition of food insecurity, though, that you do see, especially like the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization that is focused a little bit more on global food insecurity. they really include this cultural dimension of food insecurity that I think is important too. And the idea there is that it's not just about having access to any old kind of food, but that food that's culturally appropriate, that's food that you want to eat, that you feel like it's appropriate for you to eat because of your own particular background in terms of culture, in terms of what you grew up with, but also in a lot of cases, maybe religious or moral reasons that you have for why you would or would not eat certain types of food. From the very beginning of the semester, we talked about how culturally specific taste is and what counts as food, what doesn't count as food for groups of people. So even if you actually have access to a certain type of food, but you see it as culturally inappropriate for you to eat for one reason or another, you might actually be food insecure because you can't eat the food that maybe people are literally trying to give you. So that is an important dimension of food insecurity that I think is maybe less highlighted sometimes when we look at those numbers in terms of the economy, what kinds of income people have, stuff like that. We have to also remember that there's other important dimensions of food security as well. And as I said before, there's a real up and down, not only from year to year in the economy, but also through the year seasonally, depending on what kinds of support families have, especially families that are lower or middle income from schools or other benefits. You can really vary from time to time throughout a given year on whether or not families are experiencing food insecurity or are food secure. So one of the key things we're going to talk about in class this week is this term food sovereignty. And when we're talking about food sovereignty, it raises this question about whether or not food security is enough. If we actually feel like we're more or less stable in our food and we have a food supply, that sounds like a good thing. That's probably where pretty much everybody wants to be, that they don't have to worry about food. But the question is that enough? If you actually feel like you have more or less a stable supply of food and access to it, does that still mean that you actually feel like you have some kind of control or some kind of say in your food supply? So there's a question of justice here. And if anybody has studied things like environmental justice before in other courses, especially if you're environmental studies students, you know that there's an important participatory dimension to justice. Do you actually have a say in the decisions and the structures that govern your life? And that's where food sovereignty comes from, is this idea that people need to have a say. People need to have some kind of way of controlling their destiny when it comes to food. And especially for communities that have historically been oppressed or marginalized in some way, lack of access to a stable food supply is part of the challenge that they face, but it's not the whole story because they have been oftentimes literally displaced from land, from practices, from technologies, from food stocks, like especially seeds that are really important for them. And so food sovereignty is a movement, and it's a really growing and emerging movement in different places all throughout the world that says that not only do we want to have stability in terms of the consumption of our food, but we also want to have more control and access over the production of food, especially through access to some of those things I was just mentioning. Land is the key one, having land where you can actually grow food, but also connections to traditional knowledge systems, traditional techniques or practices, the biota, especially seeds, but maybe other types of biological materials that are important for the food systems and the farming systems that are part of particular communities' set of traditions and the ways that they provided for themselves, historically speaking. We'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we really get into this book, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. I have a chapter by Elizabeth Huber that I've asked you to read for class and that we're going to discuss in class this week. But really, any place in the world where there's been a process, especially of colonialism, where colonial settlers came and displaced indigenous communities, or in the case of slavery, brought a diaspora of people from one area of the world into another and really disrupted everything about their lives, including their food systems and how they produce food. Those are situations where those communities are now trying to figure out a way to decolonize the way that they eat and the sources of their food and take more control over them. And so really there's kind of a shift here from getting support from governments, in a lot of cases governments that might actually be originally the colonial oppressors that shape the situation that your communities are in now and brought about the system of structures of oppression that have oppressed you, and try to really wrest control over those production systems and take charge of them and make them your own. There's a question here about to what extent this actually can happen under our system of economics that we have at the moment. And one term that's used commonly to describe the overall philosophy of our world economic system is this idea of neoliberalism. You may have heard this in other courses. It's become a real topic of discussion and analysis in a lot of different disciplinary fields, including food studies. But the idea is that the colonial powers are the ones that still kind of call the shots in a lot of ways in our world economic and political system. And to what extent do they have a set of ideologies and requirements that they put on different states, different communities that would affect their ability to feed themselves and to have some kind of control over the food systems in their communities and in their countries. And so overall, neoliberalism is this approach that says free trade, limits on government regulation, and people being responsible for their own destinies is the best approach. It's kind of based in kind of an idea of classical economics that if we just kind of let unrestricted markets take their course, that people will follow those incentives, assuming they're doing the right thing and not being lazy or being irresponsible in some way. And that will be the best way to govern our world political and economic systems. Now, note here that when we say responsibility under the neoliberalism view, it doesn't necessarily mean self-determination. It means, like I said before, you're not supposed to be lazy. You're supposed to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and succeed. And self-determination, I think, is the key twist here, that food sovereignty advocates really want to be able to have their own sense of control and self-determination over food systems and not be governed by these same structures that regulate our world political and economic system. So in a way, it's a critique of neoliberalism, but it's also a way to try to escape the structures of a global neoliberal system that, of course, regulates to a very large extent our food systems, how food is produced, how it's distributed, what we have access to. How can we get away from that is some of the ways that food sovereignty advocates are starting to ask questions and starting to develop social movements around. One important social movement that's a good example of this is Vie Campesina. Again, maybe you've heard of this in another course where you've studied social movements, especially in a global context. It's a movement that started in Latin America and it really has started to spread more around the world. It's focused in this idea that especially peasant farmers in Latin America, now increasingly in other places, are trying to bust out of this kind of colonial legacy that shaped land and especially the elite control of land in places like South America, Central America, other places where people were displaced or made to be essentially quasi-slaves or sharecroppers on land that they would kind of have access to, but not really control over. And so these movements, these food sovereignty movements like La Vie Campesina, are advocating for greater control by small farmers, small shareholders, displaced communities, migrant workers who want to have greater determination over their food and especially the production systems around food. So if you look at their website, I'd recommend, if you want to take a deeper dive on this, just to look up La Vie Campesina and read up a little bit on their website. You can see that they actually have this event coming up later this month that's about struggling against capitalism and patriarchy, and they actually put it in terms of a virus. So kind of connecting it with the pandemic and the ways that the pandemic is affecting the globe, including especially people like this who have been marginalized for decades or centuries and are trying to find ways to have greater sense of self-determination. And if you look at their description of themselves on their website, they really put together a lot of the things that we've talked about so far about people who've been displaced, who are landless, indigenous communities, migrants, workers around the world trying to build unity and solidarity. and trying to especially focus on the tools of food sovereignty as a way to promote social justice and dignity and oppose corporate-driven agriculture that destroys social relations in nature. So that kind of brings together a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about here about food sovereignty and maybe how it goes beyond food security as a way of describing not only a challenge, but also a movement that's really trying to shift our way of thinking about how people can truly be food secure in this kind of broader political, economic, cultural way. So if you do want to take a deeper dive on these topics, like I said on the prior slide, I do recommend taking a closer look at the Vie Campesina website. You can also just Google news on them, and you'll find some interesting stuff. There's increasing amount of scholarship too that I can point you toward if it's something that potentially maybe you're thinking about connecting to a research paper topic. Also in our Google Drive folder, I put an article by two food studies scholars, Mares and Alcon. It's a really good article that helps describe some of the terms that we discussed in this lecture recording in a little bit more depth, especially the distinction between food security and food sovereignty and the key role of neoliberalism in that distinction and some of the challenges there. You may also want to look at this book I actually just found myself. It's from a couple of years ago, so pretty recent, but it's called Farming While Black, and it's actually about a food cooperative and collective and farm in the Albany area, so not too far from us. I've really only had a chance to scan this book so far, but I know it's been getting a lot of attention in food studies circles, and especially people who are interested in these issues of food sovereignty. In this case, we're going to be talking a little bit more about Native American communities in class, but obviously African Americans are folks who have a long tradition in the U.S. Going back to slavery times of being agriculturalists, being farmers, having real important knowledge of using the land, but to what extent did they ever have the ability to have their own land and control that land and use it to produce their own food? In a lot of especially urban spaces around the country now, African American communities are starting to try to find ways to develop land in their area and take control of land that can help produce food and support their communities. I'll talk a little bit more about that in class before we jump into our discussion. A couple of discussion questions just to mention. As we read this chapter by Hoover about Native American food sovereignty, I just kind of wonder what some of the dimensions you can identify. You'll see that she actually talks about a couple of key ones, and those are things that I think will be interesting for us to discuss and say to what extent Native Americans maybe are a unique community, broadly speaking, but also because Native American is such a broad term, are there ways in which it actually doesn't capture some of the challenges, some of the opportunities that different Native American groups around the country face, that face around the world in terms of their the challenges of becoming food sovereign? And then last of all, to what extent do we think we can address these issues of food security or food sovereignty within the current set of structures that we both farm and eat within, if we actually really want to make sure that communities can have some kind of self-determination in terms of their food? Do we need to break out of some of the structures that we have, or at least modify them in some ways to allow people to have a little bit more of that self-determination? That's something we'll talk about more in class, and I'll see you soon.